Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Acts video. All right, we're back with another alternate history hub what if video. And this one is, what if America never joined World War I? Now, if you didn't see it, I just covered one from last week from them, and it was what Germany could have done to win World War II. So make sure you check that one out. I'll link it below. All right, original video link is down below. Please support Cody and his crew, and I'm going to let you know what I think. Here we go. All right, as always, I want to hear your ideas about this. What, if America never joined World War I, how do you think that would have impacted the war? I want to hear what you say, so please comment down below, and you'll hear what I think as I hear their ideas.
World War I. The Central Powers
War
lost.
to end all wars.
Spoilers. Just 3 years after Franz Ferdinand got shot, Europe was already reaching its breaking point. The Central Powers were almost falling apart, Germany was suffering food shortages due to the Baltic blockade, and both Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans were on the brink of collapse.
Yep.
The Entente wasn't much better off. Russia got so tired of fighting other people, it withdrew from the war to fight itself.
They hated the war so bad they became communist.
In the UK were going deep into debt to pay for food and war material, while morale on the
That debt going to the U.S. U.S. was making a fortune off of this war.
front line slowly eroded, but both sides believed they could still win, or at least survive.
I love the
longer
World
than
War I
other.
propaganda,
so they fought
by the way.
on, with no end in sight. Then Uncle Sam joined the fray.
Yep.
The Entente's morale was boosted tremendously as millions of fresh American soldiers began mobilizing. The Central Powers' morale
1917.
cratered. Germany launched a desperate last-ditch spring offensive to break the Entente lines and take Paris before the Americans could arrive.
That was the
didn't
goal
work.
for the Germans the whole time, was to do that. And they got close. I mean, they got within a few dozen miles away from Paris. And again, if Paris goes, we saw it in World War II, but if Paris goes, France goes with it. And the French and British had to hold that down with everything that they could, without the Americans. All the Americans were help financing things. So get that going on.
Didn't work. The lines held. The Rohirrim arrived, and the Central Powers
The Rohirrim.
accepted defeat. So, on the 11th hour of
Here's the train
11th
card.
day,
11th
the 11th month of 1918, thanks to Uncle Sam tipping the scales, the war to end all wars ended until the next one.
You all know the famous story, right, of Germany signing this armistice in that train cart. That same train cart was then used by Mustache Man in World War II to make France sign its surrender, in a big twist of flexing and irony.
In the aftermath, Europe had suffered 4 years of war, so it was kind of riddled with devastation and economic and social instability. But hey, the US joining at least got it over with, shortened what could have been a longer and more devastating war. And while stability, for most of the nations, is good, stability is no fun. So
Now, I for one think that Germany would have, with the United States hadn't come on, and I want to hear his arguments, but going into this, that Germany could have really kind of turned the tide of the war, mostly because they were pulling their troops out of Russia because they signed the treaty for Russia to get out of the war. And we're going to be pushing troops out to the west. Then it would become, basically a war of attrition. Now, I don't know exactly. Maybe if it would have ended that way, not even necessarily with the German victory, but it definitely would have pushed things and made things a lot more difficult for the West, with the possibility maybe of, winning, getting Paris, and then making Paris have to surrender. And then from that, the British should have to decide if they want to keep fighting or not. And maybe they stay back home, they pull out, and Germany, takes control of France. And that's it.
let's have some fun. Let's
All right,
make
what do
it
we got?
worse. So here's the thing. America really didn't want to join the war.
Right.
I made an entire video on how most of the U.S., especially Woodrow
Wilson even won
was
election
hell-bent
campaigning on that
staying out
first
of the
time.
conflict. In short, the average American didn't really care about Europe.
And the government didn't either. Remember, this was still basically like Monroe Doctrine, his idea that America is going to be more concerned about the Western Hemisphere, and that Europe, whatever, going to have allies, but not going to get involved in those things. And Europe shouldn't get involved in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. basically called dibs on it.
See a reason why they should cross the ocean to fight in the deadliest war in human history.
Yeah.
Because some princeling got shot in Bosnia?
Nope.
Where's that?
That's why the war
I
wasn't
live in
about that.
Missouri. Wilson believed the U.S. was morally above war against Europeans and should instead only participate as a mediator in the peace deal.
But again, the irony is the United States was practicing so much imperialism in the Western Hemisphere at that time.
Fortunately for Wilson, Germany couldn't have done a worse job for PR, but they were really good at forcing the US to join the war. That was the one thing
Multiple
they were good
things.
at. At the start of the war, Germany used unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic,
Right.
sinking any ship suspected of carrying war material to the UK, whether it flew the flag of a neutral country or not. This included sinking the Lusitania, which killed over 100 Americans. The American public
That was pretty early in the war.
understandably not happy about
They don't
this,
join for another
and
couple of
forced
years.
Wilson to warn Germany to stop sinking neutral
We're gonna hear
ships.
Zimmerman.
Slap on the wrist. Germany agreed, temporarily, but by 1917 they started doing it again.
Yeah, they redid it. Well, what had happened was, so the Americans, obviously a huge part of their economy is selling stuff to and doing business with Europe, but it's a war zone. And one of Germany's strategies was to try to blockade their enemies like France and Britain from getting those goods. And of course, among those goods were war materials, which in Germany's eyes definitely saw the Americans as not being the neutral nation that they said they were. But nevertheless, it's capitalism, right? It's like it's business. People, there's money to be made in war, and American manufacturers, of course, were doing that. But yeah, there was supposed to be these deals, and there were these deals that the Americans wouldn't be, supposed to be or weren't going to be doing the sale of these like weapons goods. But what ended up happening is it was happening illegally. So these companies were still doing it. So they would smuggle it on ships that, didn't look like those merchant ships. The Lusitania, for example, was used to smuggle war materials into Europe. And the Germans knew this. They knew this was going on. That's why they started the submarine warfare, unrestricted submarine warfare again, because there was plenty of evidence that American companies and the Americans were not abiding by those trade rules.
Of course, they knew this would anger the Americans, but instead of doing anything sensible, Germany sent the infamous Zimmerman telegram
This was
to
a
Mexico,
backfire.
asking them to attack the US to keep them from joining the war. Honestly, this is one of the most perplexing decisions I've ever seen a modern nation do.
Yeah. I mean, they proposed it. Now it got intercepted. The British got it, and we're like, hey, America, look at this. You need to be pissed. Please join us in the war. Now, that deal never mounted to anything. Mexico was like, no. And maybe the Germans overestimated Mexico and thought, hey, remember when you guys lost like half of your country to the United States in the Mexican-American War 60 years before? Wouldn't you guys like to get that back? Because that was part of the deal, that Mexico would help with, distract the United States, and the Germans would then help them regain a lot of those territories of the Southwest. But yeah, Mexico was like, no.
Why would you ever think this was a good idea? When this became public,
they were
Wilson's
convinced the
hand
Americans were going to
was
join at
forced.
some
He
point.
declared war. Also, let's get this out of the way. Mexico wasn't going to attack America to reclaim Texas and all of this. It's kind of like asking an amputee to sucker punch Mike Tyson. But here's the question you actually care about. What if Germany was just a bit less careless? What if they never resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and just didn't send the Zimmerman telegram? Let's imagine a world where no matter what, Wilson gets his wish, and the US sits out the Great War. Now what?
One question I was going to ask in this scenario: are the United States still supplying with France and Britain with war materials?
Without Uncle Sam
Whatever.
rushing in with his trusty war crime
We're just saying no
grade
troops.
shotgun, the Central Powers now have a real chance at winning the war. I mean, hell, look at a random Emperor Tiger Star video and pause in mid-1917. You could
Shout out to Emperor Tiger Star, friend of the channel. He's been awesome coming on to live streams and things, so definitely check out his stuff.
assume they had the war in the bag. And while in our timeline, the loss of the broken down Russian ally was replaced with a shiny American one, without the US, 1917 is just kind of a
Russians
year
are
of
leaving,
losses
Americans are
for
entering.
the Entente. In April, the Neville offensive was a major flop, leading to mass mutinies in the French army. Germany unlocked chemical warfare with mustard gas, and who could forget the 473rd Battle of Isonzo, which utterly shattered the Italian lines.
I mean, the British ended up using the gas by the end of that year too. So both sides had it. That's kind of how World War I was. You know, it was all these new technologies, right? That's why it made it such a different war. You know, one side would introduce some new technology, then pretty quickly the other side would counter that by having a similar technology.
On the flip side,
Machine guns,
you had
tanks, gas.
Brazil declaring war on Germany. sending a whopping 24 officers to assist the French. Good job, guys.
With what?
Jokes aside, things were really looking
Teach 'em
bleak for the
capoeira?
Entente. And you can get an idea for their desperation by looking at the tens of thousands of troops they sent to the sinking ship that was the Russian Civil War, supporting an autocrat and the hope
was
that
after
he
the
would
war,
bring
though.
Russia back into the fold. Yeah, that sure worked out. We look
That was
at
after the war.
1918 today, knowing that the end
Largely.
was near, but on the day, nobody was ready to give up. Every front mattered. In our timeline, America put its hand on the scales, and in a bid to take Paris before they came in, Germany threw everything in the kitchen sink with its spring offensive that disastrously failed. That included hundreds of thousands of Eastern Front veterans who had just joined the Western Front. So here's an idea. Let's make the next 15 minutes of the video talking about a dystopian world full of misery, plotting, and turmoil, as millions fight for freedom in the Deadlands. Wait, did I do that just so I could make a smooth transition to the sponsored today's video? Yes, I did. Today's video is sponsored by James. That's right.
The guy?
James, who has been a loyal Jimmy for years. And he wrote a book. Alright, so hear me out because this is very unconventional. Rather than joining up with a publisher or
What is
buying
this?
some Google ads or whatever, our fellow Jimmy here entrusted me and this community with the promotion of his book. A new novel which combines eldritch mystery with cyberpunk gothic.
Just some dude,
This is
some
the
author?
world of John Kendricks, Dominus Carnifex of the Novus Vaticana, an executioner for the new church.
Just this
This
dude's
is the world
promoting
of
this book?
Deadlands freedom. Arcadia is a city on the brink of destruction
book.
for both outside and within, and Kendricks will have to walk a fine line between moral and damned if he's to survive.
Dude had to fork
This is
out a
only
lot of
the
money or
beginning,
whatever
the start
to
of a 6-part
advertise on
series
this channel.
spanning thousands of years. I'm excited about this novel, and I think you should be too. I mean, just look at that cover. That's right up my audience's alley. Look at that guy. That's an over-the-top
He does look
character
pretty
design
cool.
that just brings a tear to the eye.
It's like a
Whether it be
futuristic
Kindle,
crusader.
paperback, hardcover, or the audiobook, treat yourself to a fresh new world. And plus, I think it's just really cool helping a self-publisher going his own way. So I guess, thank you, Jimmy, for sponsoring this video. Alright, so where was I? Oh yeah, grueling trench warfare, filled with blood, sweat,
the worst.
mustard gas, and Eastern Front reinforcements. But you know what? While many World War I speculations boil down to buffing or removing the spring offensive altogether, rather than witnessing another timeline where tens
It'd be
of
different
thousands
this
die for
version.
a plot of land not big enough to bury them, why not do something as realistic, but more creative? Now, this doesn't leave us with a lot of options, but what it does allow me to do is to finally make a video on the war in Gaza.
Now, okay. Well, I was going to say, about the other allies that Germany had, Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, in this scenario, looks like, nothing would have changed with that. It'd still probably end up being Germany on its own.
That's right, Britain took over Gaza in 1917, made the Balfour Declaration, and then quickly took over Jerusalem too from the Ottomans. But with German aid to the Ottomans, this video could...
Now remember, Britain was promising that area to like 3 people at once. They were throwing out any promises they could to get any support against the Ottomans. The Arabs down in like Mecca, they were telling them that, hey, we're going to help you guys create like this pan-Arab state there that would include, Palestine, Jerusalem. And then they were telling the Zionists in Europe, that, hey, we're going to give you, this land too. And then also to also saying the Palestinians, like, you guys are going to get independence. And they're also dealing with the French because you're going to have Sykes-Picot agreement. They were just promising anything to anybody to get support for World War I, and they all got screwed over. Because the British end up keeping it anyways with the British mandate.
Oh, I'm still not touching that topic. We need to go somewhere a little more stable, a little less contentious. Let's talk about the Balkans. Let's go back to where it all began. Now remember, no America
Sarajevo?
joining in 1917 means that over 1 million soldiers from the Eastern Front are redeployed. Most go to the Western Front, some go to Italy, and 100,000 elite troops and a lot of equipment arrive to the aid of Bulgaria. Even in
Bulgarians are
Kaiserreich,
fighting,
the Balkan
yeah.
theater of the war is overlooked. But what the Prussia of the Balkans was able to pull off was nothing short of
They're
extraordinary.
so ready for war.
That's right, we're talking about Bulgaria. Bulgaria is not talked about a lot, but the Bulgarians proved
Valley of
themselves
Death.
to be way more reliable assets to the German war effort than Austro-Hungary or even the Ottomans.
The Bulgarians actually did pretty incredible under the circumstances. The more I've learned about that.
Second front against Serbia ended its valiant last stand. When Romania joined the Entente and invaded Transylvania, Bulgaria brought it to heel.
Dracula.
The small nation of just 4.5 million people had mobilized 1.2 million men
Quarter their
who fought like
population.
hell. And in 1917, they managed to secure a win against an expeditionary force from Britain and France,
Yep.
who had superior numbers and equipment
not talked
at
about
the
enough.
Battle of Doiran. Greece
Shout
was
out to my
tethered,
Bulgarian
caught
friends.
between a Bulgarian invasion from the north and an Entente blockade in the south, which was applying pressure to the Greek king, who favored Germany. The Entente had committed just as many men to the Macedonian front as they did in Gallipoli, and in 1917, Germany was ready to match that. As far as
Gallipoli.
realism goes, the Central
Fail.
Powers were already heavily assisting Bulgaria, providing military experts, equipment, materials, and multiple divisions. But here, we see them triple those figures by the end of 1917, as thousands trample over the remnants of Romania to join the war effort
Rip.
against Greece. The Entente would also increase their support, but considering the bleak state of the Western Front, that increase would be minimal.
You know, this all reminds me, just the craziness of the Balkans, to that one quote that's from Otto von Bismarck, where didn't he tell Wilhelm, like, stay out of the Balkans, like, stay out of the Balkans, it's a mess, like, never get involved in the Balkans. And then bam, they get involved in the Balkans after the assassination. Bismarck was totally right. All right, invasion of Greece. Here we go. Okay, now we're getting the alternate
Now, I know what you're
realities
thinking,
here.
Jimmy. Germany up against the mighty 300 at the gates of Thermopylae? Not quite. Because the Central Powers didn't have to slog their way through all the mountains of Greece to get to the capital of Athens.
There'd be a new
They just
Thermopylae.
needed to take Salonika, where the main Entente base was, barely 100 miles from the Bulgarian border. Sparta was a relic of the past, and Athens was the political center of Greece. But it was Salonika that
It's really
needed-
actually depressing for Sparta now. It's like a truck stop. It's like you would never have thought that history that they had existed when you go there today. Obviously with Athens, you got the Acropolis, and yeah, it's in ruins and stuff, but Sparta is like, yeah, it's kind of depressing.
to take.
But also,
The
they weren't
Entente-
into some of those architectural things and those projects that the Athenians were. They thought the Athenians were like wasting their time. It's like, why would you do that when you could like work out?
had stationed so many soldiers in the Thessalonian coastal city that the locals began to call them the Gardeners of Salonika. Spring
Gardeners.
1918. Generals Otto von Bellow and Gorgy Todorov prepared 300,000 men for a joint invasion in Albania and Greece. At the center, we see what's left of
What
the
are you hoping to
Serbian
get out of
army
Greece,
fight
though?
tooth and nail against a formidable Bulgarian opponent.
Why put this much in?
Franco-British positions near the city are impenetrable, but over on the west, we are back to our good old spaghetti-eating friends, the Italians. With such a
Spaghetti.
wide front against a foe that was literally bullied
Spaghetti.
into joining the Entente, lines don't
Italy
hold
just
out
wants
for so
Croatia,
long.
though.
And when things go sideways, with morale at rock bottom, how hard do foreign expeditionaries really fight for Greek dirt? The
True.
German divisions
Don't give a
take
crap.
Iomenia, Gastoria, and threaten Larissa, while Bulgaria completes the northern encirclement.
You'd think
Whether-
at this point, like, yeah, like look at all these foreign nations that are here, like defending or attacking Greece. It's like, how would you keep morale up? Because morale is so bad at this point of the war. And yeah, you've got these German fighters that are heading down there. You got the Bulgarians, you got the British, the Italians. Italy's interest is a little bit more, north of the Baltic. They don't want to take over the Greeks, but like, could they keep morale up to actually do an invasion like this, which would have been, extremely bloody?
Whether the pocket in the city
Morale was
withstands a
dead in
prolonged
1917.
siege with the aid of shipments is irrelevant.
Even if the United States
the road
didn't
to
enter.
Athens is open, and rebels begin chanting the name of their exiled king, Constantine. By the end of spring, the Entente defeat
You say like
Greece
Pericles,
is assured, which leads to major repercussions. A separate peace is signed, and all foreign troops, including what's left of the Serbian Legion,
going to war.
sail away. Greece is forced to cede land in the previous Balkan wars to both Bulgaria and the Ottomans.
No.
Greece would be forced to pay severe war reparations and demilitarize, and would find itself a lot less constitutional with a lot more monarchy.
I'll be honest, I did not think there'd be this much talk about the Balkans in this alternate scenario. I totally just, with my Western focus, was just thinking about how it would have impacted the war in France. So I'm not like prepared to like analyze this part of the Balkans here of all this stuff would have happened just because the United States wasn't there. But, you know, I just would have thought that so much more would have gone into the Western effort, the Western front at that time, because it, again, had been this stalemate. So I don't know, maybe it's this idea, kind of like a Schlieffen Plan idea, where it's like, okay, get rid of the Balkans, so there's really nothing between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, and then go all into the Western Front?
German monarchy. That means that while life in the trenches was still one of the worst things imaginable,
Ugh.
German soldiers could at least enjoy a nice bottle of olive oil, courtesy of their new protectorate.
Thanks.
While the olive oil bit was a joke, seriously, don't drink this stuff.
Thanks,
It's
Poseidon.
also kind of not. Like in our timeline, after the fall of Romania, the Treaty of Bucharest was signed, and its terms were way harsher than that of Greece. Despite his German origins, the Romanian king was deeply invested in the national interests, so he was handed with a brutal ultimatum. Romania ceded territory, disbanded most of its army, leased all of its oil wells for a short 90-year
Dracula
contract.
turns himself over.
And also would remain under occupation until further notice. Greece would be getting off easy by comparison. Fun fact, those
I forget
same
what
wells
Romania
would
looked like back
ironically
then. It was that crescent shape, you know, obviously it changes later, but that crescent shape kind of wrapping around the Carpathian Mountains.
keep the German tanks fueled for much of World War II.
Those towers are awesome.
The treaty was signed in mid-1918, and for the following year, millions of oil barrels were transported to Germany.
That's such a
alongside
huge
a ton of grain.
thing.
Now think about what this means in this alternative timeline. A front line is closed. The Entente loses its two biggest allies and footholds in the east. A lot of resources make their way west. But the biggest impact here is psychological. On the inside, Germany is hanging on by a thread.
Yeah,
Hundreds
that's what I would
of
think.
Thousands of dead civilians from malnutrition as a result of the Baltic blockade. The Ottomans are still struggling to deal with both Entente forces and growing unrest. And Austria-Hungary was on the brink of completely disintegrating. But
Can I add another alternate history? If this all stuff goes as planned, do we get Hitler? Do we get the Hitler that we know is going to exist? Probably not, right? Because it just would have changed a lot of things.
that means little to
Depends
the
where
average
he
Entente
ends this
soldier.
video with.
A soldier who keeps getting promised something bad will happen to the Central Powers, and it never comes. Meanwhile, their own news reports just show immediate disasters. Belgium, Serbia, Montenegro, Russia, Albania, and now Greece have all fallen. The Entente was losing on every single front in the war.
By the way, are we also assuming that the Russian Civil War would have ended the same way it did in this alternate timeline? Like, is there any possible way that you get the Russian Civil War, maybe Russia like re-enters the war or something? Like, what effect would that have?
With no hope in sight, and the Wehrmacht was only 50
Probably
miles
not.
away from Paris. At this point, the sunk cost fallacy that kept the Entente going has kind of hit rock bottom. So what happens next?
Okay.
Keep in mind, if peace talks are announced, like morale plummets, leading to more mutinies like the one that followed the Neville offensive. But the Western Front doesn't completely collapse. By the end of 1918,
Especially with the British, I
everyone
would
was
think. I
done
don't
with the
think
war. America wasn't coming in on a white horse to help the Allies, and by almost every metric, the Central Powers were winning. For the most part, the key objectives of the Central Powers were achieved, and then some. In the peace, America might finally attempt to intervene, with Woodrow Wilson offering to mediate, laying out his 14 points for a lasting peace in Europe. And the
We're assuming the 14 points would have still been the way that it was. So much of what went into that was a response to what was going on at the end of the war and the fear for the end of the war. I'm not sure this would happen like this.
world, only for the Kaiser to dismiss him as a stupid Anglophile
Okay.
and toss his proposal
Okay.
into the nearest pig pen.
That's
With
better.
Wilson laughed out of the room, the real talks
Yeah, I mean, the Germans aren't going to concede anything. I mean, remember in a way, like the French kind of laughed off the 14 points too. They were like, no, it's not harsh enough against Germany. Britain kind of feeling the same way. Okay, I'm back in.
Lorraine and Alsace are secured, and the subjugation of Serbia, plus Brest-Litovsk, already exceeded expectations, and adding the rest of the Balkans and Belgium on top was just an added bonus. Since this point of divergence has a slightly less unhinged Germany, this increases the likelihood of Kaiser Wilhelm sitting down and jotting out a treaty which would still humiliate the Entente, but not do to them what they did at Versailles. Brest-Litovsk is reaffirmed.
and probably because they were going to be the aggressors. The biggest thing that supported the hostility of the Treaty of Versailles was the fact that, France and Britain felt like they were the victims, especially with France, that they were the victims, and it was now in the hands of the victims to do what they will with the aggressors, as they felt the Germans were. So that would make sense.
Belgium becomes a German puppet state. Luxembourg and border territories of both France and Belgium are annexed into the Kaiserreich. The majority of Serbia and Montenegro enter the Austro-Hungarian Dominion. San Stefano, Bulgaria becomes a regional superpower. Romania and Greece become German puppet states. Germany takes colonies from Belgium,
what happens Ottoman
France,
Empire,
and maybe the UK.
That's something to think about. Oh man, all the colonial possessions. Here's the thing though, there was fighting here in World War I. What would the effect of all this have been on the fighting? A place like Tanzania, which was German and gets kind of taken over, like what would the effect be there? I mean, is Britain just going to sign over, you think, those colonies? I guess that would have to be part of the treaty, because Germany wouldn't necessarily have, won the battles there. But then there could have been a lot of things, if it did go down that way, that the British would have to, handle. You see all like the red stuff in the map? Those are British possessions. So they were trying to. That's why they fought in Tanzania there. The British wanted a full connection of states from Egypt all the way down south to South Africa. They actually had plans for a railroad, a trans-African railroad from north to south.
Colony in Africa, spanning from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And finally, while the Entente threw Italy under the bus in our timeline, in this alternate timeline, the Central Powers do the same to the Ottomans. Sure, they don't lose land, but there is no way the British cede Egypt. So apart from a few
Suez Canal,
islands
too important,
and some territory in the Caucasus, the Ottomans get a high five and a participation trophy. So Germany becomes an economic empire.
The Ottoman Empire is done. I mean, they still had, though, to deal with the Arab revolts, and they wouldn't have been able to withstand that either. So, I don't know, it's almost like in that way, almost that Arab state potentially could have had like more possibility there. I got to look back at some of my thoughts and research when I was did my thesis on Balfour Declaration, the Arab response to all of that.
With no economy. Because world wars and empire building cost money, and no one has any. After 4 years of conflict and over 20 million people dead, almost everyone in Europe is pushed to, or in some cases over, the edge of collapse, all for some colonies to change hands, and more of Europe's ruling class to speak German.
This made me think of something. Do we get stronger socialist revolutions now in a place like France? Could France have had a revolution like Russia did, or at least the real growing of a legitimate socialist party?
Even more than in our timeline, no one wins the Great War. Everyone loses. Some just lose harder than others. In our world, the war to end all
No,
wars.
you know who wins? The United States. United States already became the superpower after World War I, and that was being involved in it. Now it's like they probably would even more as they emerged unscathed from this war. And now once things settle down, America can jump in, big time.
Ironically spawned the deadliest conflict in human history. But here, things kind of get messier. The Treaty of Versailles and Sykes-Picot drew lines in broad, linear strokes that
what happens to the Middle East
following 100 years. But that's because the Americans and the British Empire were able to actually enforce it. What happens if the more unstable side somehow wins? Bulgaria is the one that comes out in the best shape, since the territory it gets are mostly of other Bulgarians, reconquests from lands that were lost. That said, they would be vilified by their neighbors, who, if they ever got rid of their pro-German governments, would be very happy to dogpile at the first opportunity. But what about a dying Ottoman Empire
it was already the
with a
sick
young
man of
Turks
Europe
movement and control over the Middle East? Who has to deal with the issue of Palestine? What about an Austro-Hungarian empire who lost its charismatic and progressive prince, only to gain more angry minority groups, now including furious Italians, Poles, and Ukrainians?
Yeah, so they would just get more protests and stuff. Maybe another assassination, like Ferdinand happens here. They were already hated by all these groups, so they would have to deal. It seems like all these groups they would be dealing with internal disputes. I already told you about the Ottomans and what they would get from in the response from like the Arab community, and now you're getting this with all the diversity of amount of groups in the Balkans. Like all these groups would have to now they would probably just start fighting back. They'd fight these what would you call it, like resistance movements.
And finally, an even more depleted Germany, still on the verge of democratic, socialist, and fascist uprisings, who now had colonies to govern, several puppet governments to prop up, and millions of angry Bolsheviks on their back door. What happens is chaos. Sheer and utter chaos.
You think so? I mean, do you really think like Bolshevism and like communism would really, like, it would get more popular in this time? It seems like it would just solidify the status quo of their imperial monarchy.
Unless, since the French Revolution, France has replaced its government every time it lost a war, and a couple of extra times just for sport.
This is where I do think there could be a
the same would happen in Italy,
socialist revolution in
teetering
France,
on the edge of civil war between socialists and Catholics when they won the war in the first place. Yeah, there would be full-scale coups and or civil wars in both France and
He didn't say what would happen to
adding
Italy,
to the
though.
Catastrophe that had already begun in Russia and Turkey. To put it bluntly, a devastated and bankrupt Europe is not good for business. And if America cared about one thing, it was business. With three great powers collapsing and potentially turning socialist, along with rising socialist movements in many countries throughout the world, the US would be in the middle of a much, much worse Red Scare.
Okay, let me process there. Because I did think the United States would try to come in and pick up the pieces in a way that would help the American, empire, I guess, American economic state here. So with a Red Scare, so what, they're going to go and try to squash, that could happen. Go ahead and just try to squash all of these socialist movements that are definitely going to come up here. They're definitely going to come. That's what I think, at least.
In 1920, Woodrow Wilson is still in office, technically, and by that point, several anarchist bombings and the Palmer raids assured the arrival of the Red Scare in the US. It's notable to mention that the losses suffered in Brest-Litovsk take out 80% of the Soviet's agricultural sector, most of its coal and a good chunk of its population too. This nerfs the Bolsheviks and Russia as a whole, while adding a ton of dissent for Germany to deal with. On the other hand, leftist movements would be widely more popular in France, Italy, and still Germany. What this means is that the United States, in a panic, officially makes Germany its second biggest trade partner and does everything it can to prop it up. They might not have wanted Germany to...
I could see this. I could see this now because the Germans are, the German government is now going to be the, anti-communist party there. And yeah, they probably ally in a lot of ways, especially if they can find some kind of economic advantage. But do you think they would just give up on the cultural alliances that the United States had with Britain and France, or maybe not go as hard as they did in like the actual Cold War into these places that are prime for socialist revolutions?
Win the war, but since they did, well, you pick what you can get. After all, while Germany suffered material and manpower losses, the thing it needed the most was cash, and Uncle Sam could provide at least a good chunk of it.
True.
This would keep Germany afloat for a few years. And by
United States would be doing it with everyone,
which would by this point only be in one piece because of Germany holding it together. But further east, the rest of the alliance begins to crumble as far left and far right protests continue to destabilize German puppet regimes, and the Reich just doesn't have the manpower or willpower to preserve everything. But
So
all it
does
would take
World War II still happen? It's just we've flipped a bit who the like socialists and the capitalists are going to be.
is one outburst from Wilhelm, one serious rebellion put down by force, or one key Bolshevik win for the Reich to implode. A step in any direction from this point is hard to predict.
See, I'm just not so sure that, like, you know, the Social Democrats did quite well after World War I in Germany, but that's because they lost. I'm not sure it would have that. Do you really think there'd be like these uprisings in Germany after the war against their government when they, you know, won the war?
Deserves its own video. But what we know
Because that was
for
such
sure
a that was
is
such a
that
platform of these socialist movements was an anti-imperialist take.
Lenin dies in 1924, with Brest-Litovsk being an even bigger disaster than in our timeline. Trotsky's fall and Stalin's rise is assured, and maybe that is when the powder keg explodes. Who knows? In any case, I hope you enjoyed this alternative take, which I think is not only realistic, but kind of fascinating.
You wonder if now, I'm kind of into this idea now, though, that Germany and Russia would still maybe fight later on. It would just be not this Nazi regime, but this, I mean, maybe the monarchy kind of goes kind of fascist. I mean, they may be in this, you know, growing empire that maybe they do have to put down these sort of like communist revolutions that could be happening there. And if they did that, would that be in Germany? Would it be them trying to put those down in France? Does Germany try to, you know, spread itself kind of like the Soviet Union did after World War II? So like Germany becomes what the Soviet Union was in World War II, but Germany does this, you know, here in the 1920s. That's something to ponder.
Quite different from many other Kaiserreich universes. Who knows, maybe you hated it, I don't know. And speaking of alternative universes,
got me thinking.
I really do recommend you give Deadlands Freedom a shot.
Cool. All right, final thoughts. All right, you heard from me from throughout the video. I want to hear from you guys. I'm going to put a comment below that you can reply to, but go ahead and put down your ideas of what you think would happen if America never joined World War I. All right, see y'all next time.